We get started? Good afternoon, everyone.
Recording in progress.
My name is Betty Joseph. I'm a faculty member in the English department and interim director of the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today. And before I do that, I want to thank a few people who were instrumental in making this event possible. The anthropology department at Rice for co-sponsoring the talk. Kamla Vishweshwaran, professor of anthropology and South Asian studies, who was involved from start to finish with the planning of this lecture and its twin event, which was a colloquium for graduate students that took place yesterday. Thanks also to Addison Verger from anthropology, who helped with all aspects, technical and logistical, and with the publicity for the event. Our speaker this afternoon is Professor Anna Singh, professor of anthropology at University of California, Santa Cruz. Dr. Singh received her doctorate from Stanford University and went on to teach at University of Colorado, Boulder, and University of Massachusetts, Amherst, before joining UC Santa Cruz in 1987. From 2013 to 2018, she served as a Niels Bohr professor and director of the Aarhus University's Research on the Anthropocene, also called AURA. The author of scores of articles, 3 monographs, and 8 edited collections, Dr. Singh is one of the leading scholars writing about the nexus among the cultures of globalization, economic restructuring, and environmental degradation. Her research deftly tracks both the macro and the micro worlds that emerge out of these systemic entanglements. Looking at the arc of Dr. Singh's work and the variety of encounters recorded there, we would be mistaken if we thought that what we are witnessing is a discipline that has moved away from the strenuous demands of fieldwork among the unfamiliar. Rather, the sense we get from Dr. Singh's work is that of a committed practitioner who has always challenged her own methodologies, objects of study, as well as the formats and the language in which they are expressed. Her 1994 monograph, The Realm of the Diamond Queen, was a winner of the Association for Asian Studies Henry Bender Prize. Through Dr. Singh's study of the Meratus Dayak of Indonesia, we learned how a remote group of rainforest dwellers become archaic survivors, that's her phrase, in the 20th century, when corporate and governmental demands for resources and land threaten the autonomy and mobility of marginal cultural groups of once inaccessible places. Her next book, Friction, An Ethnography of Global Collection, was a 2004 winner of the American Ethnological Society's Senior Book Award. Here she catches up with the Meratus Dayak a decade later, only to discover that their once remote world is now global, as the forests of the Kalimantan province are whittled away by extractive industries from North America and Brazil. The environmental issues already pressing in these earlier books are at the front and center of our award-winning book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, on the possibility of life in capitalist ruins. This book won the Victor Turner Prize and the Gregory Bateson Book Prize in 2016. And it's a highly influential book that has a curious informant, a mushroom, the Matsutake mushroom that is found worldwide, but thrives mostly in damaged forests. Singh invites us to enter the world of the mushroom, listen to its story, and to think with it. It seems to me that reading this book is a transformative experience in itself, because Singh trains your imagination to be attentive to all kinds of life teeming around you. For Dr. Singh, that singular act of observation and description, curiosity as she calls it, is that gift that her anthropological training continues to give her, and I guess indeed all of us. Indeed, To survive a planetary peril, we may all need to learn from the practices of collaborative survival that the Matsutake mushroom has already perfected. Dr. Singh is a recipient of numerous distinguished research awards and fellowships, including a Guggenheim in 2010 and the Huxley Memorial Medal in 2018, the highest honor awarded by the Royal Anthropological Institute of Great Britain and Ireland. In 2013, a $5 million grant by the Danish National Research Foundation resulted in two of Dr. Singh's recent innovative collaborations directed through the AURA program. The 2017 collection, Arts of Living on a Damaged Planet, a serious but curious encounter between social scientists and the inhabitants of many academic enclaves, creative writers, historians, environmentalists, ecologists, biologists, physicists, cultural theorists, and philosophers, among others. We will hear more about the second collaborative project, Feral Atlas, today in Dr. Singh's talk, which is titled Field Guide to the Patchy Anthropocene. And with that, let me hand the mic over to Rigoberto Quintana. Mr. Quintana is a second-year PhD student whose research focuses on the development of infrastructure in El Salvador, Mexico, and Los Angeles. He studies how material spaces embody epistemologies and how communities interact with their built environments within a context of climate disruption. He will also tell you about the format for the Q&A following the lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Joseph. Greetings, everyone. My name is Rigoberto Quintana, and as was said, I am a second-year PhD student in the Department of Anthropology here in Rice University. Thank you for taking the time to join us today, wherever you may be. On behalf of the Department of Anthropology, the co-organizers for today's lecture, I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming today's speaker, Dr. Anna Singh. Aside from Dr. Singh's many distinct accomplishments mentioned by Dr. Joseph, a few of Rice's graduate students from throughout the university had the rewarding experience of being a part of a workshop with Dr. Singh yesterday. In our discussion, we were able to explore the theoretical and analytical work of her scholarship. Within our conversation, we discussed and challenged the limits of temporality, current methodologies, and structures of academia itself. I look forward to today's lecture and discussing the topics brought up here with everyone here. Before we begin, I wanted to quickly go over some of the formatting following the lecture. We will dedicate 45 minutes for the lecture and around 30 minutes for Q&A. So please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box or send them to us via the comment box at any point during the lecture. You will also have the opportunity to raise your hand on camera or with the emoji feature to ask your question. I will remind everyone to please mute your microphones if you haven't done so already. And without further ado, please help me in welcoming Dr. Anna Singh.
Thank you so much. It's really a delight to get to talk to you today. I just heard yesterday there might be a couple of natural scientists in the audience. I'm delighted. I will say the project I'm going to talk about is an attempt to bridge the humanities natural science divide. But since I didn't know that you might be here, it's really aimed towards humanists. I hope you'll forgive me and still look at the project. Same with the artists. I might gloss over your work a little bit today, but the project itself is really indebted to art and other media. So please look at it, even if the focus of my talk today is on for the humanists. The Anthropocene. You've probably heard the term. Let me custom define it loosely for the moment as a time of human-caused environmental catastrophes. When humanists first heard the term, most reacted in criticism of this new word. This was important work, but it wasn't enough. Scholars are now involved in a second phase of engagement, describing the Anthropocene. Such description across scales is really important, and it goes beyond taking a predefined Anthropocene, say climate change, and asking how particular people talk about it. Instead, we need social and natural histories of the Anthropocene as it emerges in its materiality as well as its representation. That's where my field guide to the patchy Anthropocene enters. In my talk today, I'll show you how critically engaged description might proceed. My talk will do this by introducing my recent collaborative project, Feral Atlas, the More Than Human Anthropocene. I've generally avoided talking about work that's already been published, but there's two reasons that seemed important, both involving things that I learned after the publication of this project online. First, it turns out that most reviewing publications won't touch a digital project. Without reviews, no one knows about the site, and it hardly counts as scholarship. I feel obligated to the contributors of the project. I'm doing the best I can to spread the word by mouth. Second, it turns out that most scholars who do look at it can't find their way to the conceptual apparatus. Perhaps viewers are dazzled by the art. Almost no one notices that the project's not just an art project, but a contribution to scholarship on the Anthropocene. This seems unfortunate, not only because our group worked hard and for many years, but also because I believe we have something important to say. The co-editors are considering putting together a paper and ink book to reach the scholars we lost through the digital. And maybe by the end of your comments tonight, I'll have a sense of whether you think this is a good idea, or write me an email afterwards. I'll value your thoughts about this conundrum. The particular contours of this conundrum push me to do something else I don't do, cast my arguments against those of other scholars. I don't feel the need to make you dump or dismiss others. However, since I'm trying to convince you that the project is scholarship, not just play, well, the most direct way is to do this is to show you how our theoretical work interrupts that of others. So I'm going to use contrasts between Feral Atlas arguments and those of other Anthropocene scholars. I've chosen contrasts with scholars I completely respect, and I'm not trying to get you to dismiss their work. I pose an alternative in full acknowledgement of the importance of these scholars. They are worthy interlocutors. My talk today is an experiment in pulling out some of the framing arguments of Feral Atlas to see if they have traction for you. Hopefully, it'll make for an interesting discussion. Before I begin, again, with the framing propositions of Feral Atlas, let me show you how to get to those arguments themselves. This is the cover page from Stanford University Press at www.feralatlas.org. So you begin by clicking enter, and then this is the landing page. I'm just using screenshots today since my internet is weak and I don't want to risk crashing. On the real version, these feral entities are drifting and bobbing across the screen. For those of you who like digital applications, just click one of these feral entities and you can go on an interactive adventure. For those of you who are dedicated readers, let me show you the two icons you really need. And one is this 3 lines that's under this screen and every screen. If you click them, you will do what we call opening the drawer. There are a bunch of instructions in the drawer, as well as over on the right-hand top, a link to the reading room where the framing essays are. But let me go back to the landing page before we go there. On the top left, you should see a brass key. And if you click that, oops, why is this? Nope. You'll get to what we call the super index, or the index of indices. And for the moment, let's ignore that and go on to the next. No. Okay. If you just scroll down, you'll get to the reading room where all of these framing essays are found. And they're quite short because it's a digital project, but they are full of scholarly ideas. Please read a few when you have a chance. Okay, let me go to the 4 propositions about Feral Atlas. Here's the first. The Anthropocene is planetary, but is also patchy. The Anthropocene should be studied through its spatial heterogeneity. I'll go through this in a moment. Right now, I'm just listing the propositions. And my worthy interlocutors here are climate scientists and humanists who work with them. The planetary nature of the Anthropocene is a basic tenet for many earth scientists, and I'm in their debt. But we need more than that. We need to appreciate the patches that underlie the planetary, making planetarity itself uneven. When I speak of patches, I'm using an ecological definition. Parking lots, suburbs, plastic gyres in the ocean, these are all Anthropocene patches. I found it useful to understand patch formation in part in relation to infrastructure.
Nada más y también decir que pues
I wish
es
I
una
knew
lástima que la
social
secretaría haya
projects.
sido tan restrictiva el tema de la consulta. Yo creo que a veces, muchas veces
I
las
worried
cortes hacen miedo.
another thing. Okay, great. Okay, so I'm just talking about patches and infrastructures, by which I mean social projects that change landscapes, waterscapes, or airscapes. This is a bit broader than some definitions of infrastructure, but it's very much in the legacy of considering public works as well as corporate ones. Infrastructure is an important thinking tool in Feral Atlas's analysis of the Anthropocene. We argue that infrastructures have feral effects. Non-human attunements to human infrastructures are feral because they're shaped by human action, but outside human control. Meanwhile, as I'll explain in a few minutes, it's difficult to see feral effects of infrastructure if you consider infrastructure a network, as has become customary in anthropology and STS. Network theory is good for many things, but it obscures feral effects. Thus, my proposition, as material apparatuses, infrastructures have feral effects which make up the Anthropocene. But these are obscured by treating infrastructure as a network. All of this will be unpacked later in my lecture. I'm just listing now. My third proposition is about time and temporality. The Anthropocene is a geological term. That's what that Ocene indicates. This means it has to have a single planetary beginning and end. Yet for a patchy Anthropocene, that temporality makes no sense. Anthropocene patches come into being through multiple temporalities, and part of the project of description is to explore just what temporal modes and durations matter. There cannot be one single beginning for the patchy Anthropocene, but this works crosswise to geological definitions. My fourth proposition is that many non-humans are mutable on human timescales. Just as changes in what humans are up to make history, so too changes in what non-humans are up to make history. Rather than static pawns in human dreams and schemes, non-humans are historical actors, and often at scales we can recognize as relevant to our own histories. For worthy interlocutors here, I could have picked all the classic arts and sciences. That's too big. Instead, I'll focus on those tenets of 20th century biology that took history out of biology. These same tenets are unreflexively at work in a good deal of today's humanist criticism focused on the environment. I'll mention the humanist criticism of the invasive species concept as an example of this problem. Criticizing invasive species discourse as xenophobia goes down too easily as humanist common sense in the Gramscian sense of unquestioned hegemony. My intervention might clarify why it's instead worthwhile paying attention to non-human human alliances and the livability of landscapes. So those are my four propositions. Don't panic, story lovers. I will tell stories, but with a purpose to explain these propositions. So first, let's treat the Anthropocene as patchy. Most of the time, people think of Anthropocene as climate change and thus planetary. Climate change results from human burning of fossil fuels in factory and car engines. Where does this burning take place? The production of carbon dioxide, as well as its victims, brings us to particular places. It is patchy. Geologist Jan Zalazevich, working with artist Anne-Sophie Milon, writes about patchy CO2 production and its effects for Feral Atlas. In this Milan painting, the patchy production of CO2 in factories, as well as its deep time consequences in rocks, are shown. This Milan painting of a coral reef bleached by rising sea temperatures works to remind us of the patchy occurrence of victims. In some cases, global warming causes droughts or fires. In other places, floods or storms. If we ignore patchy planetary ecologies, we can't understand how global warming changes the Earth. Furthermore, there's more to the Anthropocene than extra carbon dioxide production. Just to get started, consider industrial toxins, radioactivity, the extinction crisis, and the spread of new diseases, including COVID. There's no way to approach these problems without considering the patches through which they emerge. Consider environmental justice. The whole point of the environmental justice movement is to show how Anthropocene dangers are irregularly distributed, hitting some communities harder than others. We can only bring questions of justice inside of our analyses if we begin with the patchy nature of the Anthropocene. Many scholars, including prominent environmental humanists, disagree. Deepesh Chakrabarty was one of the first humanists to take the Anthropocene seriously for what it could teach us, rather than for what the term eluded or erased. And I'm greatly in his debt for this. Chakrabarty's The Climate of History 4 theses argue that climate change exceeds what humanists have tried to describe, and perhaps can describe. In contrast to the trajectories of states or the struggles of workers and peasants, climate history forces us into deep time within which humans have been present for only a recent sliver, and within which many players have been more powerful than humans. Deep time reaches into the future beyond the possibility of human extinction. It humbles us and reduces our imagined great debates to children's squabbles. In this, then, according to Chakrabarty, history as a discipline, and indeed all the descriptive humanities and sciences, are of minor use in describing the Anthropocene. We must turn for that to Earth system science. More recently, Chakrabarty has written a book on these problems, and this slide shows the cover. It includes and extends the 4 theses, showing the key contrast between humanist research on the global and earth science research on the planetary. This contrast indeed continues a trajectory begun in Chakrabarty's post-colonial book, Provincializing Europe. In that book, he writes of History 1 and History 2. The former is secular social history that tells of colonial governance and subaltern rebellions. But the latter, History 2, is what exceeds this history, such as the cyclic time of the Indian gods. Each of these has a separate, distinctive historical ontology, a way of drawing together observations into a narrative. In the new book, there are 2 ways to understand the space of life on Earth. The global is the history of empires and rebellions. It's history as usual, History 1. The planetary is the deep history of the Earth system sciences, an alternative, History 2. Although human lives and Anthropocene discourses dip in and out of History 1 and History 2, the 2 versions of what might count as history are not mutually constitutive. They remain separate, distinct modes of reflection and narration. That's why the field of history as we know it serves more as contrastive commentary on the Anthropocene rather than a necessary element in telling its story. The same could be said for any of the disciplines, humanist, social science, or natural science, that describe the world. In contrast, I argue that there's a multi-stranded Anthropocene history and an Anthropocene geography in which human and non-human trajectories intertwine. All histories and geographies in which humans are at all involved are constituted by more than human actors. Much of the descriptive humanities, in which I include history, has ignored non-humans, but that doesn't banish the reality of a more than human past and present. Non-humans are not static. For the last 500 years at least, many non-humans have evolved, reacted, and redistributed themselves in tandem with human histories. That is, at some of the same time scales as within human histories. As humanists learn to appreciate non-humans, that is, how to find their stories, how to read them, better descriptions of the Anthropocene can emerge. As natural scientists learn to appreciate humans, how to find their stories, how to read them, better histories of the Anthropocene can emerge. Let me turn to a couple of Feral Atlas reports that show how important it can be to bring human and non-human trajectories together through an appreciation of patch histories and geographies. I'll begin with a report that offers a well-defined patch, hopefully making the concept of patchiness clearer. Perhaps you've heard worries about a jellyfish transition. That is a situation where all the fish die and the main animals left in the ocean might be jellies. This has not happened across the oceans, but it happened in the Black Sea in the late 1980s with invasive comb jellies, like the one photographed here, replacing fish. A team of researchers led by Turkish marine biologist Temel Oguz wanted to understand why. The Black Sea was once a great fishery, but people fished out the big fish and then the small fish. Meanwhile, pollutants poured in from industry and nutrients poured in from commercial agriculture. Algae grew from the extra nutrients clouding the water, killing more fish. As you can see from this map, the Black Sea is relatively enclosed, with an opening only at the Bosphorus Strait, which you can see at the lower left. The map shows the internal currents making their own patches. The water was hardly refreshed from the ocean, and when an alien species, the comb jelly, was brought in the ballast water of a ship, well, it found its place. The comb jellies gobbled up the baby fish, and suddenly there were no more fish, just jellies. Luckily, a few years later, a different jelly organism was imported, again by mistake, in ballast water. The new jelly ate the original jelly, restoring more diversity to the Black Sea. The Black Sea makes a simple patch to conceptualize. There can be no history of this jelly transition without attention to the patch. There are also other significant elements in the story, including multiple timelines and the catalyzing effect of an exotic introduction in an ecosystem already made vulnerable. But let me move right along to one more patch-oriented story, and this one at the heart of environmental justice concerns. Sociologist Scott Frickel has been mapping brownfields, that is, abandoned industrial sites. These maps are from his research in Rhode Island, one showing brownfields across the state over time, the other showing a particularly dense cluster in downtown Providence. At the heart of the issue is the toxins these sites exude, especially during storms. As Frickel explains, a fundamental feature of urban economies everywhere, industrial churning drives the incremental yet continuous spread of chemical hazards throughout urban areas, altering the chemical composition of city soils, water, and air. Recovering the lost history of these sites gives city residents opportunities to reclaim a personal stake in their city's environmental history and its future. You're probably aware that toxic sites are not distributed evenly, and that communities of color have been differentially stuck with toxins. I'm hoping it's clear to tackle environmental justice and to understand basic ecological shifts, we need to map Anthropocene patches. Patchiness belongs at the center of an analysis of the Anthropocene. Neither the global nor the planetary in themselves are enough. My first proposition makes a difference for the kind of scholarship that matters. If the Anthropocene is patchy, we need all the field-based sciences and humanities to participate in its description, its mapping, its storytelling. Philosophy and criticism on the one hand and planetary modeling on the other are fine, but not enough. Fieldwork matters. We cannot know the Anthropocene and all its patchiness without it. Proposition 2. Anthropocene patches emerge from the feral effects of human-made infrastructure. This proposition offers a way that scientists and humanists might work on landscape-scale problems through shared curiosities. I started on this analytic path from thinking about trains. In so many places in the world, railroads changed what was possible for life. Here's a report from Feral Atlas. Historian Iftekhar Iqbal shows how railways changed society and ecology in the 19th century Bengal Delta. The Ganges River builds land in the Bengal Delta. At the beginning of the 19th century, new farms appeared every year from the sediment, stopping landlords from asserting full control. Immigrants poured in to work the new land. The Bengal Delta was the rice bowl of South Asia. But then the railroads came, blocking the flow of water and sediment. New land was cut off. Meanwhile, the water collected in stagnant pools blocked by railroad embankments. These pools formed perfect environments for the escaped imported plant, water hyacinth, which grew so well that it blocked navigation, smothered rice fields, and bred hordes of mosquitoes. Rice became harder to grow, landlords gained power, famine ensued. As Iqbal explains, in the Bengal Delta, the Anthropocene began with the arrival of the railways. An infrastructural project changed what was possible for life in the Delta. For thinking about the Anthropocene, it also seems useful to extend the idea of infrastructure to include all kinds of landscape changing public works, and not just public in the sense of government funded, but also in the sense of socially mandated, so private corporate ones count too. One of these projects has been commercial plantation agriculture, which has deeply changed what kind of life is possible for humans and others. Rachel Seifer writes about the addiction to chemical toxins she found among soy farmers in Argentina. Every time a particular toxin stopped being effective, they turned quickly to some other, even deadlier toxin. The system bred herbicide-resistant weeds, such as the Palmer amaranth shown in this photograph, and it's the green plant among the ready-to-harvest, that is brown, soy. Infrastructures have feral effects. Taken together, these feral effects constitute the Anthropocene. This way of thinking about infrastructure both depends upon and pulls away from how anthropologists and science studies scholars have studied infrastructure. Here are the covers of two state-of-the-art anthropology volumes. They both depend on a pioneering article by Brian Larkin, the reference for which I've added on this slide. Larkin accomplished something extraordinary. By combining insights from anthropology and STS, he stimulated the development of a new field. Larkin's article is not just a review, it helps constitute infrastructure as an object of study. No wonder subsequent scholarship has relied on it. Larkin begins his article with this definition. Infrastructures are built networks that facilitate the flow of goods, people, or ideas and allow for their exchange over space. His contribution is to add that word, network. Anthropologists had been studying the making of roads, dams, and the like. By adding the concept of network, this research enters a dialogue with science and technology studies in which information systems were iconic objects of study. Public Works Project and information systems make common ground through the concept of the network. Imagined as a network, infrastructure becomes a system of communication and fantasy production, as well as a technological system. This approach has produced important results, as for example, when Nikhil Anand, working in Mumbai, draws together engineers, political fixers, slum dwellers, politicians, activists, and bureaucrats into a single system through the technical operation of the water supply. Water is delivered through the network. The faulty functioning of the system, just like its successes, can be a network element. Both fault and fix produce political socialities through the network. This is useful, But note that the function of the water system to deliver water, whether poorly or well, defines the network. What this approach cannot do, because materiality emerges only as it serves the network of infrastructure functionality, is to consider feral effects. The feral effects happen when the material apparatus enters non-water delivering networks. The analysis of infrastructures as networks can be material, but as the editors of The Promise of Infrastructure argue, materials must be studied within the network that makes the infrastructure function. The alternative, the editors imply, is a naive positivism. I can't do the work here of showing the non-positivist alternatives. For now, let me note that feral effects are, by definition, excluded. This is not a reason to throw out this amazing work, but it means we need alternative approaches to infrastructure. Let me return for one moment to the railways of Bengal. The spread of water hyacinth is not in the railway's network. It has nothing to do with the railway's flow of goods and people. It doesn't even impede the network of the railroad. It's outside the train transport network. That's what makes it so important for studying the Anthropocene, that is, the concatenation of out-of-the-network effects of infrastructure. Considering the network is not enough. Let me turn to my third proposition. The patchy Anthropocene emerges from multiple temporalities. The time as a problem comes to life in relation to the geologist's definition of the Anthropocene as an epoch of Earth's history. Here's a chart of official geological periods. The Anthropocene, if accepted, will be right up on the far right where it says today on this chart. Eons, eras, periods, and epochs are by definition homogeneous planetary time blocks with a clear separation before and after. Each of these starts with something clearly marked in the Earth's strata, which is called a golden spike. It sets up a time chunk that should be treated as uniform across the planet. This way of organizing time draws from a set of long, powerful Enlightenment commitments to the universality of nature. And it's good for some things, but not others. What it's not good for is a description of the patchy Anthropocene. It shows all of Earth at one glance. It cannot show patches. And thus, too, it cannot show conjunctures, that is, moments when multiple histories come together with a bang. Feral Atlas aims to show these kinds of conjunctures with an analytic tool we call Anthropocene detonators. Instead of an epoch, a detonation, and not just one. Detonation is a different way to conceptualize temporality. It's not a timeline. Indeed, it refuses timelines because they block attention to conjunctures across place and time. It's not an epoch with its uniform and bounded periodicity. It owes something to Walter Benjamin's thesis on history, in which memories rise up at a moment of danger. Rising out of the conjuncture, infrastructure building programs give rise to Anthropocene effects. Neither timelines nor periods are sufficient to describe this process. To call out some key conjunctures, Feral Atlas uses the words invasion, empire, capital, and acceleration. Because of these words, one critic suggests that we're once again blaming the white man. This is a misunderstanding. Feral Atlas moves away from a politics of personal blame to look at structural transformations of land, water, and air. That these might be labeled with terms such as invasion and empire is a consequence of the importance of European expansion in the making of the contemporary world. Indeed, we follow key contributions to scholarship on the Anthropocene in calling out these particular detonators. We offer an entry into the ever-present Anthropocene question. When did the Anthropocene begin? We take seriously the answer that scholars disagree. The most common answers to that question posit a 500-year Anthropocene, which corresponds to European expansion into the New World, a 400-year Anthropocene, corresponding to the building of European empires, a 200-year Anthropocene, corresponding to the Industrial Revolution and the rise of capitalism, and a 75-year Anthropocene, corresponding to the first atomic bomb and the global development era that starts at the end of World War II. Instead of arguing that one of these answers knocks out the others, Farrell Atlas argues that the projects of landscape transformation signaled by each of these timelines are all important. Each catalyzes a change in what's possible. Each makes new Anthropocene patches. Each qualifies as one kind of beginning. We need them all. We call each of these major transitions in how humans live on Earth an Anthropocene detonation. To show how these programs of detonation work, Farrell Atlas co-editor Fei-Fei Zhou has drawn collages of historical reference. Here's invasion. A good number of geographers, biologists, and indigenous scholars want to tell this story. 500 years ago, the European invasion of the Americas changed what was possible in life on Earth. But the date for us does not establish a chronology. In places such as Australia and New Zealand, European invasion came much later. Settler colonial transformation of landscapes continues around the world today. This is not a chronological kind of time. Farrell Atlas shows the force of invasion as a conjuncture, a detonation through a collage of historical scenes that take place across place and time. The landscape shows Spanish conquistadors on the right, but there are Australian Aborigines fighting British invasion in the 19th century, and the Brazilian Amazon burning from contemporary cattle invasion and the settler colonialism of North American suburbs, all in the same story. Please zoom in your own perusal of Farrell Atlas for a closer look. There's an argument here about time. We argue that a related set of invasion-oriented infrastructure projects, such as the wholesale transfer of exotic plants and animals, tie these scenes together across chronology, but yet with the historical force of their conjuncture. Each of Farrell Atlas's 4 detonator landscapes houses its own handful of Farrell Atlas stories of particular patches and critters, with the idea that each of these stories helps think this mode of time, and conversely, that conceptualizing time this way adds dimensions to these reports. Let me give a few examples of how thinking with the conjuncture might be useful. Latina scholar Rosa Fisek describes the introduction of pasture grasses into Latin America, together with the cattle of colonial settlers. The grasses hold back the regrowth of forest, and thus to dispossess the indigenous people who use the forest for livelihood. Australian Aboriginal elder Russell Ngadiali Ashley paints invasive cane toads introduced foolishly by colonial settlers. The toads kill off Aboriginal ancestral animals, both clan totems and livelihood. The death of goanna lizards are being mourned in this painting. The invading cane toads are on the right. Historian Elizabeth Fenn tells of the smallpox epidemics that killed so many indigenous people in North Dakota between the 16th and 18th centuries. Different times and places, different technologies of distribution, yet these stories have something in common. The conjunctural force of settler projects, designed or not designed, as transmitted in the organisms settlers carried with them. Farrell Atlas groups these through the Anthropocene detonator, invasion. In considering how the Anthropocene comes into being, we need to read these stories together as they, working together, have the power of an explosion. One common history is not enough. the patchy Anthropocene has multiple beginnings and multiple timelines. A colleague recently asked me to come up with a consolidated timeline for the Anthropocene. I just can't do that because human-caused environmental effects do not follow a single planetary chronology. If anything, the timelines I can imagine look something more like the lines in the sand created by burrowing sand crabs. There are lots of them, and groups of them each converge in a hole, a dropping off point where society and ecology change radically. If I had time, I would show you some of the other modalities of time explored in Feral Atlas, such as the TIPPERS, infrastructure-mediated state changes. But given the challenge of arguing 4 propositions in 45 minutes, I need to turn to my 4th proposition. Non-humans are historical actors, and they often work within human timescales. The heft of this statement stems from its strangeness, not only in the humanities, which have allowed only humans to be actors, but also in 20th century modern synthesis in biology, from which history was expelled. In the modern synthesis, which united evolutionary theory and genetics, organisms merely reproduce themselves over and over. Each generation was exactly like that before it. This is what I mean by the refusal of history. This refusal was possible because it was believed that the germline, the bits of the organism that make reproduction possible, was completely protected, isolated from the environment and thus history. Once a species emerged, according to the doxa, it became caught in its own static cycle of reproduction without history. In the last 30 years or so, this orthodoxy has fallen apart. Most biologists now appreciate the ways organisms and their environments constantly interact, shaping the next generation. Rapid evolutionary responses, epigenetics, interspecies development cues, horizontal gene transfer. These are some of the many ways organisms change their practical essence historically. In ecology, I'm sorry, this is a landline, so I don't know how to shut that thing off. It'll stop in a minute. Take a breath and listen to the phone. I think that's it. Okay, so organisms are changing all the time, and it influences the next generation. In ecology, disturbance rather than equilibrium has become the storyline. Meanwhile, genome sequencing has opened the field of phylogenetics, the study of evolutionary relations among species imagined historically. New non-human histories are appearing at many scales of space and time, and these catalyze opportunities for transdisciplinary explorations of the Anthropocene. Human and non-human trajectories interact, producing more than human histories. I can't emphasize enough how important these are for understanding the Anthropocene. Here's an example of a non-human history told by a biologist in Feral Atlas. Forest pathologist Matteo Garballato has traced the US spread of the terrible plant disease, sudden oak death, by following the changing genomic signature of the disease as it settles and spreads, interacting with new hosts. This map is of the San Francisco Bay Area of California, with my home in Santa Cruz, this red dot at the lower right. It turns out that the US landing place of the disease, carried on an ornamental plant shipment from a commercial nursery in Europe, was not far from Santa Cruz in this cluster of black dots. The circles all show places the disease has been tested, and with detective-like verve, Garballato and his colleagues followed its changing signature as commercial shipments from the original node spread the ever-morphing disease to new trees and new forests. This kind of history is relevant not just for natural scientists, but also for humanists. Humanist histories are also more than human. African-American anthropologist Paula Ibran has been studying the experience of the kidnapped and enslaved people sent from West Africa to North America. She found that she could not study this experience without intention disease environments that were built by the institutions of slavery. One of these disease environments was the ship itself, where people were chained and packed like cargo. In this environment, a new strain of disease-carrying mosquitoes emerged. The new mosquitoes were dependent on human water sources, such as the fresh water carried by the ship. They spent all their time with humans. The same species of mosquito in Africa lived in holes in trees and rarely encountered humans. But this new shipbred variety allowed the yellow fever virus to spread in epidemic proportions, sickening both enslaved people and their captors. We can only know this through the same kind of phylogenetic detective work used by Garbellato. Here, Ibran combines that story with her understanding of enslavement to describe a more than human patch of Anthropocene horrors. Developed in conditions of human captivity, the new mosquito variant carved a deadly historical trajectory through the New World. Another intertwined human and non-human history that should concern us is that of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Again, phylogenetic history is essential to understanding the historical emergence and spread of these bacteria. But there's a human story too, and telling these together is the key to Anthropocene storytelling. Medical anthropologist Jens Seberg describes two human scenes that have been key to this combined human and non-human history. The waste drains of pharmaceutical companies in India, saturated with antibiotics, and the industrial livestock facilities of his home country, Denmark, where animals such as the pigs you see here are routinely dosed with antibiotics. Constant saturation with antibiotics allows bacteria to develop these new abilities. Human infrastructures have feral effects. By telling human and non-human histories together, Seberg illuminates the more than human collaborations at the heart of Anthropocene problems. Evolution is not the only way that such history-making collaborations are formed. Living beings can adapt to human conditions without changing their genetics. They can also redistribute themselves in consequential ways. As examples of this, let me go back to two of the reports I mentioned earlier. Pasture grasses were brought with the livestock of colonial settlers in the Americas. The seeds of these grasses stick to the hides of cattle, and so the cattle carry the grasses wherever they go. This new distribution of grass has had historical consequences, encouraging the spread of ranching and discouraging farming, shifting cultivation, and forest living. The cane toads, introduced by settler colonialism into northern Australia, spread across the country along human-made roads, in the process killing off Australian ancestral animals, and indeed developing new genetic traits that give them longer legs for faster road-based colonization. Non-human histories may have genetic, adaptive, and redistribution elements. We need other species' histories to tell our own. These are examples are relevant to the interlocutors I've chosen for this part, humanist critics of invasive species discourse. I assume this will be provocative, and I hope you'll give me the benefit of a good discussion. Dozens of articles and a number of books have come out criticizing the xenophobia of invasive species discussions. I decided not to call out names here because much of this work is being produced by comparatively young, to me, women scholars. Instead, let me call out a brave exception to this literature. Masnak and his colleagues described the constant importation of new species as part of a settler colonial complex. In contrast, all the other writing I know on this argues that to label any species invasive is a sign only of xenophobia, in which non-humans are compared to immigrants. This literature appeals to a humanist common sense, but I said at the start, perhaps in the Gramscian meaning of unexamined assumptions. Look at Ashley's painting while I talk through this. Let it stand in for the invasive species discourse critics abhor. Several problems make the critical literature a foil for the approach I'm advocating. First, many of the authors aren't reading biology carefully. Many conflate invasive species with non-native species. The latter are those originally from another place, while invasive species are those that, in their spread, damage the life chances of indigenous organisms and ecologies, as do the cane toads here. Instead of getting into the details, critics often turn directly to advertising campaigns and brochures, which indeed may show terribly xenophobic politics. But the relation of these campaigns, not just to the scientific concept, but even more importantly, to organisms and landscapes, is left unclear. Discourse analysis tells you one thing, but working with the species and its relations with others would tell you more. Don't mistake me. I'm angry when I see signs on US public lands warning against foreign plants through a rhetoric that appeals to the worst instincts of white ranchers. But to criticize these signs alone misses an important opportunity to consider the landscape mattifying practices of settler colonialism. This is my second criticism. Critics of invasive species discourse rarely bother to learn anything about the species and landscapes involved. Even if species characteristics are described, they're imagined as static. Thus, my grouping of critics of invasive species discourse with the 20th century biologists of the modern synthesis. Critics of invasive species discourse don't care about histories of non-humans. Species are essences, each deserving of our love. It's not worth following those species into the field to find out the worlds they're making. As a result, the histories of interspecies relations necessary to judge the health and livability of landscapes tend to be missing. Histories of the conditions of human introduction are also surprisingly scarce. That's my third problem. All the invasive species I've heard of are companions in human projects of invasion. There may be some exceptions, but I don't know them. Take the cane toads on the right of this painting. The Yolngu artist says his people don't know where they came from, but white Australians know. The toads were imported to eat grubs on sugarcane plantations. Now, sugarcane, it's an obsession and an icon of European invasion. The toads are collaborators in this project, in which flippant biological introductions have been all the rage. I don't see any reason to obscure the toads' involvement. Criticism of invasive species discourse is easier than learning the history of Anthropocene patches. Still, because invasive species, like all other non-humans, are historical actors and within human timescales, they're collaborators in the Anthropocene, and we should get to know them. Instead of abstracting discursive categories from the material world, why not explore the interplay of human and non-human histories, as these involve us with both words and worlds? Back to my fourth proposition then. Non-humans are historical actors and sometimes dangerous collaborators in the Anthropocene. If we take this seriously, we need to describe the Anthropocene patches they help make. Fieldwork is reaffirmed as essential. Projects that cross the great divide separating arts and sciences become thinkable. Critically informed description, rather than relegated to a back seat, becomes the most important thing we might do to study the Anthropocene. I probably annoyed most of you with one or more of my propositions. That's okay. Argue with me, challenge me, help me see things your way. I look forward to that, and I'm sure I'll learn something from you. Please look later to see if you can recognize all this and more in Feral Atlas. If you disagree, that's fine. Just don't dismiss the site as an ornament just because it's digital. Thank you. I look forward to your comments and questions.
Recording stopped.
Great. Thank you so much for a wonderful talk, Dr. Singh. It's informative and thought-provoking. I know there's a lot there. So just to reiterate what was mentioned earlier, if you have any questions, please add those to the chat box, or if your camera's on, or if you could turn it on, just raise your hand or use the raised hand emoji reaction that's there on Zoom. Just so to begin, does anyone have a question right off the top?
Maybe it will help if instead of highlighting, we open it up to everybody and people could turn their cameras on. And so we could try and turn this into a more interactive scene.
Sounds good.
I would like to know a little bit more about your thoughts regarding description and critique and multimodal engagements, because this is definitely a great example of that. And I have a PhD in anthropology and also have a art practice that is keeping me very, very busy. And I've been discussing recently with the editors of American Anthropologists about their new manifesto for ambiguity. So the place for ambiguity and description, and that seems to be something that they are encouraging, and kind of came to me with those ideas in mind. But then I'm always left with, well, what about the critique or the sort of more in-depth storytelling? Yeah.
I'm not quite sure what you're getting at, but I think the reason people dismiss description is it's gotten labeled as without theory. And I think this is a really false dichotomy between description and theory as two really different things. Just as description is necessarily charged with a set of frameworks and propositions, that description is always pulling together some materials and not others, and the theory comes out of that. Similarly, theory is also referring to a set of practical parts of the world, even if it's hidden. And so the idea that theory and description are completely different things is part of the problem, in my opinion. And that, sometimes when I talked about critically engaged description, it was really trying to reaffirm that the best description is very self-conscious about what to include and what not to include. And that the best theory is really thinking about the kind of traction it might have with particular projects of description. So I really want to work against that. And I really do believe that if we want to study something like environmental issues at a planetary scale, which I embrace, it's got to start with the description of patches.
Great, thank you. Yes, that was spot on, in line with my question/comment. Thank you.
Kamala, you're muted.
Thanks. I can ask a question while people are continuing to think. Thank you, Anna, again, for a really provocative and stimulating set of propositions. I guess I would love to hear you say a little bit more about the methods for finding the patch. Like your examples are so compelling. And I love the crab diagram as kind of a model for thinking about time and also the spatial configuration of convergence or conjuncture. But could you say a little bit more practically for those of us who are interested in engaging in this kind of work? What are the networks that you build? How do you find them so that the patch itself is emergent? Is there an emergent method for you for finding the patch? Finding is not the right a verb, but I think you have a sense of what I'm getting at. For surfacing the patch, maybe.
I mean, it's a great question, because it sounds quite terrifying, to say all the patches are different than each other. when you're following a particular phenomenon, the patch emerges indeed from the phenomenon itself, in part. That if you're studying the spread of a disease, the size of the patch depends on where the disease is going. So while it's possible to ask about a disease in this county and maybe has some uses for the bureaucracy of that county, in fact, if we want to know, what's going on with this disease, we have to follow the disease around. So in that sense, patches are non-scalable in the sense that you can't assume that they'll be nested in each other. And patches are emergent and changeable in relation to what it is that you're studying. When I gave an example of the Black Sea, it's the easiest kind of patch in the world, right? Because it's a bit of water surrounded by land on all sides. And I think a lot of thinking with patches got started on things that are really clear like that. But actually, most patches in the world are not so easy to find. They depend on the particular kind of phenomenon you're finding. But and again, that sounds too challenging. But in fact, in the middle of the study of it, it comes into being. My own involvement with patches came out of mushrooms. And those of you who have ever tried to pick mushrooms know that wild mushrooms grow in patches. It's just a description of this group of mushrooms that might grow around each other. So in a way, that's a good image to start with about how to find the patches where the mushrooms grow.
Sam, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Fascinating talk. I was very appreciated the points. I didn't know about this invasive species discourse, but I appreciated your analysis and found it very convincing. I'm new as well to patches, and my question is maybe a very kind of simple one, but I'm thinking about patches in relation to the article, I guess you'd say, what the patch is being applied to, whether it's clothing or sheet. And so I guess my question is is there an analogous relationship to the kind of patches you're talking about? And my sort of assumption is that it's something like the biosphere. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but whatever it is, could you say more about that relationship?
I'm not quite sure I'm getting you, but it's kind of, the question is, what is a patch? A patch is in ecology, a patch can be at multiple scales, but the assumption of the term landscape in ecology is a heterogeneous bunch of patches, and that the patches have some kind of ecological homogeneity. So that if you're looking at a map and it's got towns and little pieces of forest and some grazing land, just for example, you might say, well, that forest is a patch and this town is a patch and the grazing land is a patch, because they have, there might be some differences among them, but it's a basic way to get started. And that the more you get into the Anthropocene patches, that the patch where the toxic chemicals are in everybody's water system, that's a patch. Or the spread of radioactivity after one of the disasters of, like in Fukushima or whatever, that's a patch. And that patch spreads, you take a bunch of stuff from Fukushima and you put it over here and you've got a new patch of radioactivity. So that's why you have to watch it on the go rather than imagining that you've got it settled once you've seen the explosion of the nuclear power plant. Is this addressing what you were interested in?
I was making the assumption that this is a metaphorical device, patch in the sense of, and it sounds like you're saying it's not. So I retract my question.
Yes, not a metaphorical. It's really a physical thing, but for those of us who are interested in culture and discourse, it's equally important to follow patches, or at least for me, because I'm working back and forth between words and worlds. So the patch has a material existence, but it also that when you're trying to study some of the kinds of immaterial issues, that the patch is still relevant to how you would study those. Am I getting closer?
I think it was a flawed question. Thank you.
Okay, and Kylie, sorry, I missed your question in the chat. Would you mind unmuting yourself and asking it, please?
Sure, I just wanted to say thank you for the talk. And I was also wondering why you chose the word feral for the Feral Atlas.
Thanks. Feral, for us, means shaped in relation to human infrastructures, but outside of human control. So that's feral in Feral Atlas. And indeed, there are other uses of feral. Interestingly, some incredibly negative uses, as in the concept of feral cities, that was, which I would really disassociate myself with, and some incredibly positive, like the kinds of masculinity and bravado of the men who get out and carry dead deers over their shoulders. And I would also dissociate myself from that meaning. But luckily, neither of those has a full hegemony right now. But indeed, as with most words, I'm fighting for some space for feral to mean something that isn't defined as positive or negative, but refers to the out of control aspects of non-human action that is yet engendered by human projects.
Thank you. That's perfectly illuminating.
Okay, Lupe had your hand up, and then Dr. Joseph, and then Jing.
Cool. Thank you so much, Professor Singh, for, again, a really fabulous talk. I think my question might relate a bit to Professor Viswaswarayan's question. It's maybe a methodological question. And you mentioned your talk was geared toward more humanist, fields. And you mentioned fieldwork a lot. And of course, in anthropology, right, in-person empirical fieldwork is kind of like a ritualistic thing that we do. And I mean, can you talk a little bit more about your idea of fieldwork, what it can constitute? Can, for example, while we employ the arts of noticing that you also talk throughout your various works, lead us to an archive where we can then follow a patch there. And so just thinking a bit more about the boundaries of the field that, that can be delineated through the arts of noticing and through what we gain from employing such a methodology and an approach, which I think might ultimately be a sort of ethnographic sensibility or methodology also. But yeah, so thank you.
Thank you for that question, because absolutely I, can get too involved in an anthropological kind of taking things for granted. And absolutely, the kind of work in an archive has the best qualities that I think of fieldwork. Because for me, one of the most exciting things for fieldwork is the sense that you could be surprised, that you didn't know completely in advance what you were going to find. There's a wonderful preface by E.P. Thompson about going to the British Museum Library and being given a box of materials that was completely not what he had asked for, and was so fascinating that he ended up writing a whole book about it. And that sense of surprise in the archives is very much a part of the enterprise of learning something about particular places and times. So indeed, I wanted to go far beyond anthropology. Certainly used the word fieldwork in part to reach out to field biologists, field geologists, field hydrologists, and other folks who are doing something that's also called fieldwork. But within the humanities and the arts, that sense of noticing what's going on around you, and perhaps surprising juxtapositions that you weren't expecting is so key to my sense of sort of why we bother with being scholars in the first place.
Thank you.
Dr. Joseph, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I did want to go back to the patch, but Anna, you just got me thinking about why the patch is such a tricky thing. Because on the one hand, when you talked about networks and assemblages, one of the points you made was that people decide in advance what is the unity of the assemblage without letting the assemblage itself have its kind of movement or kind of, a flexibility, right? And then you also pointed out that the network is so mired in a certain kind of functional discourse that you cannot account for anything like a virus, for example, that ruins a network, for example, right? So I think part of the trickiness of the patch is that it is an attempt to, for me, the way I understood it is it's an attempt to define what an event is or what an object is of study or a phenomenon. That's one. But the trickier, the most thornier problem is it really questions how we begin to think about ethics of invasion, right? I mean, what decolonization, what post-colonial argument doesn't depend on the fact that you invaded my space, right? And yet that what we mean by space is not quite clear because we are not thinking nations or tribes putting fences up, etc. At the same time, you're saying, well, nature has ways of moving and taking things from one, ballast ships are doing something wrong, but when a bee takes a pollen and puts it somewhere else, so I think there's some ways in which we need to maybe separate the human ethical questions from this discussion. Otherwise, we are constantly trying to make that analogy and we get stuck. So two things. One is the boundary of what we identify as a phenomenon or event when we're using shaggy metaphors like assemblage and networks where it's difficult to cut anything off. Second is the ethical question. I mean, what is invasion if a patch is not defined materially so that you can say someone has appropriated something that belongs to me?
These are really great questions, and I'm not sure I'll fully rise to the equation to think about them. But I will continue to think about them. I think one thing that's useful in thinking about how infrastructures create patches is to get away from invasion for a minute. I indeed, in this talk, use the example of invasion because I started on it with the Feifeitou invasion landscape. But if you looked at the Empire one just as another example where, which is where the train comes in, or the dam or the plantation, that these not, which are not, I mean, obviously certain kinds of taking over other people's land is also true, but the point of empire as an Anthropocene detonation is that systems of governance come in and create new landforms, new separations between water and land, new ways of organizing crops, that if we think there about patch formation without invasion for just a minute, it doesn't solve the problem of the patch, that's for sure. It still makes it a fuzzy category that, works that sometimes when we think about the plantation, it can be very well bounded. But if we're thinking about what's the patch that's created by the railroad system, it can be very broad and uneven within a region. But I think at least it gets it out of the invasion, because I see the problem you're saying of who said that was your territory in the first place. But I'm more interested in these radical transformations of how humans and non-humans live together. that do, I mean, and so that invasion is one technology, particularly because that's done with this series of non-human collaborators that were, if we start with the New World invasion, that where the non-human collaborators, whether it's cows or disease organisms, dispossess indigenous people and push them out. That's one kind. But, capital is our third one, where we look at kind of the commodification of natural resources and places. So that's a different kind of patch formation that happens there. So that's part of why I think thinking about a variety of kinds of Anthropocene processes is important. I know this doesn't get completely at the problem of ethics that you're bringing up, but I think that starting with radical transformations of how humans and environments work together, it's not perfect, but it's got some advantages, and that it requires thought experiments to say what is a radical transformation. And of course, thought experiments are not themselves good descriptions of the world, but those thought experiments which bring us into something changed, and this is a different way of living on Earth. I think we need those, even as they're really flawed and full of a combination of ethical and historical and descriptive kinds of impulses stuck together. When did something change radically? I don't see how we can do without that, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
Okay, Jane?
Thank you so much, Professor Ching. And actually, I graduated Rice from 2019 in anthropology department, and now working at Penn. So we are organizing a symposium on infrastructure in the environment for the upcoming spring. And your talk's definitely so inspiring for me to think through these questions. But I have two quick questions based on what you've been sharing today. The first is on writing. So you've been talking again and again about your work between words and the worlds. And I'm curious, in writing about patches, what are the difficulties that you have encountered, and what kind of modes of writing that you find that's very conducive or illuminating on helping us to understanding different forms of patches or patch formation? That's the first one. The second, because I'm now also working a lot with digital media, so I'm just curious, in your own works and the works that you introduced or showed today, actually, a lot of patches that we've been seeing or thinking in screen, at least for now, are mediated realities, especially digitally mediated realities. So how do we conceptualize that gap between, say, the patches in the Black Sea that you showed us, between the actual patches in the Black Sea out there in the real world, while we actually can't see them? Those digital medias, they really visualize or through sound or through everything. But for now, it's just one mode. And also from, say, the work of Feifei Zhou that you showed, it's really compelling, but then it's another kind of digitally mediated representation. So in that sense, I'm quite curious what you think of the role that digital media would play in helping us understand patches, or actually obstructing or limiting our ability to really understanding patches in the world. Thank you.
Thanks for that. And both of those questions I could answer in many different ways, but I think it's probably most useful to answer them both in relation to Feral Atlas. That you could say all of the field reports are experiments in writing patches, and that they really range, that we have modeling of where jellyfish might go. We have historical reports on what happened in a toxic fog in 1930. We have ethnographic, we have a few things of poetry or music. So people try different experiments. And the way they work, to move to your second part, is we're trying to use the advantages of digital media. That since we want to argue for the both patchy and planetary, that these two things have to be held together, the ability of the digital site to move quickly horizontally from one story to another story across patches in many kinds of principles was our way of showing the interaction across patches, and therefore the specific patchiness of each patch, that we provided many different ways for the users to think, okay, you're interested in pasture grasses and how they move? Well, how about the water plant in Indonesia and how it moves? So you can go back and forth. So this is the pleasures of the digital, in my opinion. But it doesn't get at quite what you were worrying about, which is how every patch, as you might call it, every field report is started by what we call a flow map, which is a diagram of some kind of spatial dynamics. So you're quite right. It's not a representation of reality, but we hope that some features of it might tell us something about how space and time work in making that a patch. So we try to come up with some kind of visual representation in a few cases using other media also. Plain spraying fungicides across a banana field. And the author is writing about actually how the spray doesn't just stay in the field, but that the people who live outside the field are being impacted by the spray. But you see the spray coming out of the airplane and moving around. So that's an attempt in that little video to show how that spray works. So as you're saying, it doesn't explain everything, but in all of the pleasures of the diagram, digital or otherwise, because we can have diagrams drawn on the back of a napkin, that those diagrams try to condense some principles that might actually help us to understand the Anthropocene. And the one way that we try to acknowledge what you're talking about, I think, is by often having multiple reports about the same phenomenon, so that you can see at least different dimensions of the materiality, that in terms of the weedy plant kudzu that's taken over parts of the US South. We have one by a biologist who's got one of those regular kind of maps to show where kudzu's been reported. And then we have one by a photographer who just wants to show the overwhelming affect of being suffocated by kudzu. And that those are two different diagrammatic ways, in a sense, of imagining how kudzu creates its patches. So I hope I've addressed your concerns at least a little.
Thank you so much. I'll definitely read more.
Quinn, you had your hand up, and then Lauren has a question in the chat, and we'll be at time for Q&A at that point.
Hi there, Dr. Singh. It's good to see you again. I just had a question, and this might just be a sort of a rephrasing question. I tend to be a critic of invasive species discourse as being xenophobic, so I wanted to delve a little bit more into that, because from my understanding, that sort of discourse tends to try and think of, ecosystems as always dynamic, as always changing, and sort of like non-teleological. I understand that, or from my understanding, what you were saying is that a lot of what we call invasive species are connected to very human projects of colonialism or capitalism. And I guess going with that thinking of ecosystems as constantly dynamic, I do sort of wonder where we can draw the line between what is just typical dynamism and then when human actors or infrastructures have interfered too much into that dynamism and pushed it into something new. I don't necessarily see where we can draw that line, just thinking of humans as, you know, one actor that has more or less always been there, or, you know, for a long time in these ecosystems. So I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about that.
No, thank you for that question. And let me say, I think some of the rhetoric about invasive species is xenophobic too. So I'm not denying that that's out there. I just want to push farther exactly into the questions that you're asking about particular landscapes and just how bad things are. Because indeed, you know, like none of us seem to mind that in the US East Coast, you walk around in the forest and you find these old apple trees. You know, those aren't native species, but they aren't really doing anybody any harm. So just because it's a non-native species doesn't necessarily mean it's destroying the world. But, you know, when I think about the sudden oak death that I showed up there, you know, I'm saying that because this is my neighborhood and how it's affecting the forests incredibly, that, you know, all those people up in Glasgow are trying to save trees. But if all the trees died from these imported tree diseases, all of that pretense about saving trees is not going to make any difference at all. You know, we got so much hope in that about sequestering carbon, but actually I think the biggest threat to forests right now is these diseases that ricochet around the world because of commercial shipments that are completely unregulated. And that the idea that you should be able to send live soils, for example, around the world without any regulation at all is part of that invasion complex that is the problem. So I basically am agreeing with you that you want to start by thinking about, you know, is this thing terrible or is it not? You know, whose life's chances is it destroying? And that one can differentiate between those things without having necessarily a hardline rhetoric of, you know, foreign species are necessarily bad or something like that.
Thank you.
And Lauren, would you mind unmuting and asking your question, please?
Yeah, sure. So thanks again for this very fascinating lecture and also this really great discussion. And I wanted to come back to the second proposition because you also invited us to like sort of question it or think through it and ponder up on your different propositions. So I was really fascinated that you were pointing to the striking blind spot in the infrastructure literature here, but I was also like trying to think of all the infrastructure scholars in these volumes and beyond these two volumes you mentioned. And to mind came like Carrie Ryan Chance and Gabriele Hecht, I think, who is actually also in the Faro Atlas, but also Leslie Green and Gaston Gordillo. Other scholars who, in a way, and the way I'm reading them, are already pointing to some of these Faro effects of these human-made massive infrastructures. So I was kind of, like wondering a little bit about how to mitigate the contrast you were like, you were formulating there at the beginning of your talk, and maybe whether you can speak to some of these works too. Thanks.
I actually agree with you 100%. That lots of studies, especially the stuff that's looking at public works of various sorts, is looking at materiality and feral effects. But that's not the stuff that's the most dedicated to this concept of the network. I don't see anyone in this list, and tell me if I'm wrong, who is working across that anthro-STS thing. And that the problem with, you know, when you start there is exactly getting out of the network, that I think even the very most basic kinds of studies. I mean, Ashley Kars on the Panama Canal, he's interested in feral effects, but he didn't start out with a network perspective. And I think most of the people, I mean, Gaston Gordillo in particular is interested in ruins as his thing, you know, that the infrastructure is a way, you know, for, I mean, if there's a network, it's the network of ruination that has feral effects or something like that. So that it's a really interesting, so yes, I think you're right. And that I should have mentioned that this is not the only way to do it, but it's a very, how do I put it? The thing that Brian Larkin did for anthropologists, which made infrastructure so popular as a topic of study, is what I wanted to push open. And I think the names that you've put out are really good ones to think beyond it.
Great, thank you.
Well, we've reached the end of the Q&A portion. Dr. Joseph, did you have one final thing to say or anything?
Kamala, do you want to give a vote of thanks?
Yeah, I want to thank you and just maybe pick up on some threads of discussion in your responses to them to carry forward. I think from our graduate colloquium yesterday and today, there was, in Jin's question, a real emphasis on how to think about writing and writing the patch. And I also, picking up from Lupe's question and Betty's question, wanted us to think more about habits of reading, especially as humanists. I think close method or close readings were so much a part of how we're trained to read carefully. And I think that your work is challenging me, at least, to think more about the habits of rereading the archive, to use Lupe's phrase, so that we're reading across texts. And I think in some ways, we're doing new work that's collaborative, but we're also learning new habits of reading that enable us to understand older work in newer contexts. And I really feel like the Feral Atlas asks us to engage these different forms of reading and writing. I don't know if you agree, but that's a lot of what I pulled from our discussion today and yesterday. So thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I'm really appreciate the opportunity to present that project to you all, and actually meant it that if people want to email me, among other things, to say whether this should become a book or it's fine just as it is, I would like to know your opinions. So I've appreciated all of the discussion, and of course, see at this point how little time in a weird way we have for questions. So I'm sorry we don't get to continue. That's meant in the best spirit.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
And actually, Betty and Kamala, if you could stay on for just a minute, that would be really nice.
Sure.
Nice seeing everyone.
Bye-bye. Thanks a lot, Rigoberto.
Yes, thank you, Rico, and also Addison for all your help with the
Yes.
tech.
Rico, stay on too, if you're willing, for a minute. The only, when you give a live talk, you go to reception afterwards and you get a sense
I know,
of how
I
it
know.
goes.
I know.
And you have a sense.
I think the students asked, right? Will there be a reception after the class?
Well, but the speaker also gets a sense of like, did that work as an experiment or didn't it work? It was like, where were the failures to learn from and where are the things that worked? So if you don't mind, partly because it was a hard talk for me, because I don't normally go after anybody in any of my work. And so I decided to try it out as an experiment and just want a little feedback on, okay, what about that as a strategy? Is that something I would ever do again? So, or just to chat with me about things you saw